Welcome, SOLD family, to part 7 of the SOLD Alliance's Who Gets to Thrive series. And a special welcome to those of you who may be new to the SOLD Alliance and our work. My name is Samantha Kova, and I'm a proud member of the SOLD Alliance team by way of Education Council. I want to quickly get to our panelists since I know for sure that they're going to drop some important gems for us today. But because we're joined by some new friends, I'd like to take a brief moment to ground us in why we're here today. So it's no secret that at its foundation, our education systems are steeped with deep structural racism. And this is by design. As a country, this is who we have been historically, but this is not who we have to be any longer. Anti-racism and designing for equity is about deconstructing systems and actively choosing a new purpose and path forward. Leaders from the SOLD Alliance, we came together across our fields of research, practice, and policy because we believe that knowledge from the science of learning and development can drive transformative change in education and youth-serving systems. And this includes significant knowledge about the impact of racism and white supremacy on thriving for young people. Which brings us to today. Today's discussion is part 1 of a 2-part conversation to explore the role and impact of policing in learning environments. Here at the SOLD Alliance, when we use the term policing, we're referring to its broader infrastructure, culture, and practices. And this includes dress code, those punitive discipline policies, harmful teaching practices, and the myriad of other ways we continue to criminalize and surveil young people in their learning environments. What does it mean to exist in a learning environment where you're constantly operating under a sense of threat? What are the possibilities when you're feeling physically, emotionally, and identity safe? Who gets to thrive? I'll turn to our speakers to explore this further. Today, we are joined by Camille Farrington from the University of Chicago, Jason Akonofor from UC Berkeley, and Mary Helen Imordino Yang from USC. Camille, I'll turn it to you.
Thanks so much, Sam, and I'm so excited to be here and be able to have this conversation to 2 of my dear friends and colleagues, Mary Helen and Jason. And want to start off just by kind of reiterating Sam's point that we're thinking about learning environments and the way they feel to young people and what that does to their ability to participate, to show up, to engage, and to learn in those settings. And these could be school settings, they could be out of school settings. We're thinking broadly about any learning setting or youth development setting. And as Sam said, policing, we're imagining that broadly in the sense of surveillance and control as being the mode of relationship and interaction within a space. And that can be and that gets played out through kind of more punitive or exclusionary disciplinary practices, through dress code that we're going to keep an eye on how you show up and how you present yourself. And we're going to have something to say about that and want to control that. All of these things can make anybody feel like constrained, watched over, and that can be problematic, but it can take on a specific meaning when it's steeped in questions of racism, of white supremacy, and brings up in the young person's mind, to what extent is this a relationship or is this interaction about me, or is it more about who I am, my racial identity, my gender identity, my sexual orientation, my gender expression? Like any of those things can cause questions in the young people's minds. So we get 2 really great different scholarly perspectives on this today with Jason and Mary Helen. And to open up, I just want to, Jason, I'll start with you. Like, as we come into this conversation, it's just like, what are one or two big ideas from your research, from your work in these areas and studying some of these questions? Like, what are one or two big ideas, kind of foundational pieces that we ought to keep in mind as we engage in this discussion?
Thank you, Camille, and thank everyone for having me today. I'm happy to be here, and I think that this is a topic of great importance. One or two foundational ideas that come to mind on this topic that, unfortunately, I don't think the scientific community has done the best job of relaying to practitioners. Is the first one's about just how we think about bias in the first place, and so how that can enter into a school, for example, or how we think about it, but then also how do we measure progress? How do we determine that what we're trying or what we're looking at, something's not working versus is working as it pertains to these effects? And so on the first one, typical research over the past several decades on bias has come to understand it as an automatic process, meaning that all of us have a biased self in us, and that biased self can translate to discrimination, for example. And with that, naturally, a lot of the effort to do something about the issue is to reduce people's bias, to de-bias them. And this has become so ubiquitous with like the types of quote unquote implicit bias trainings or diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings that we have in a variety of settings that can lead us to believe that that's the only approach. However, more recent work has shown us that those type of approaches are generally not very effective, and that the effects do not last very long as it pertains to trying to de-bias people. For example, Betsy Paluck this year came out with a paper with 418 experiments over the past 30 years, and this is what she found. And so the first foundational idea is thinking not about bias as a person, and so not as like this person is racist, but what could be more effective and beneficial, and that's what our work is showing, is to think about the context. Think about bias as context-based. Think about what type of situations create a context in which bias is functional. And then importantly, as it pertains to solutions, how can we be architects of context to create situations in which bias can be rendered not functional, and that might be a more effective approach. And so as a really brief example, there's a lot to the story, but I went through a lot of schools in Memphis, Tennessee as a child, and my brothers misbehaved, a number of things. We got kicked out a number of times. That's why I went to so many schools. Those schools had wired fences around the premises, metal detectors at the front door, video cameras in the hallways. They could feel like a prison, not just for us as students, but for the adults at the school as well, and could put a mindset in mind of policing. Whereas after 10th grade, I received a full scholarship to attend an elite prep school on an island off the coast of Rhode Island. And they have a private beach. The teacher-student ratio is like 8 students to every 1 teacher. It costs a lot to be there. It took a lot to be, like, you can't just buy your way in, so you have to take a number of tests. And that could create a context in which teachers already expect that their students are people, growing children, growing adolescents. They have that potential for growth, but that also that they're all on the same page. And so just a slight example of how context matters and how we can think about the context. And then the second foundational idea is just what we measure. Similar to what I was saying before, if we measure the outcome as people's bias itself, we might find that we're not going to be able to get rid of people's negative bias. Or when we do, those effects might last a week and then it'll come right back. And that it may be more effective to instead focus directly on the outcome of interest. For example, suspension rates or racial disparities in the suspension rates, or as we know, also referral to law enforcement from school, expulsions, corporal punishment, things of that nature. But yeah, sorry, I went on a bit, but those are two foundational ideas that I think are really important that we communicate from the scientific community.
Thank you, Jason. Much appreciated that. So from a social psychological perspective, the questions of bias, questions of what context and how we measure that we're making positive difference on that. Mary Helen, from a neuroscience perspective, what are one or two foundational ideas that that you'd like us all to keep in mind as we engage in this conversation?
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you, everybody, for joining this really important conversation, and thank you, Jason, for leaping in so I can build off of the foundation that you just laid, which is hugely helpful. So I think the really important ideas that I think are really foundational that are coming from the neuroscience and the sort of the developmental psychosocial science is some of why what Jason said is the case. And because understanding the mechanisms by which people learn and engage with one another and how those learnings and processes of engagement actually shape their development over time, even physically their brain development, is really fundamental to the durability of these kinds of biases and also to the amazing potential of engaging young people in environments where they feel safe enough to really think well and build a different level of engagement with their own sort of self cultural context and possible future, right? So what we're learning in my lab, but in many in neuroscience and other kinds of labs across the world, is that the experience of thinking, right, the subjective feeling of engaged cognizing around something that matters is a deeply poignant force in young people's development. We're even showing that the brain activity that young people show when they engage with complex thinking about messy social issues that they report to us in real time, they really are deeply engaged with and really care about and think are very important. As they engage with that thinking, they are activating regions of the brain that also are telling you if your heart is pounding, or if you have a stomach ache because your lunch didn't sit well with you, or if you're under threat, right? So the very same regions of the brain that are managing stress physiology and internal gut viscera physiology are the neural platforms that are playing out our subjective experience of thinking and being within a context. They're not separate systems in the brain. They are the same system. And they're being leveraged simultaneously for multiple kinds of jobs. One is to keep your body alive and make sure your heart's pumping enough for you to have the right amount of blood, for the amount of exercise you're doing, and for the amount of threat you're experiencing, and for the potential that you're going to need to jump up and defend yourself, either physically or emotionally and socially and culturally, right? So you are literally physiologically readying yourself to engage in certain patterns of meaning making and interpretation and reactivity, depending on the way you subjectively make sense out of an experience. And I mean that in a kind of verb-like way. You construct subjective experience of that context. So it's not an objective measure of what somebody else says happens that really determines. It's how you experience that is shaping your brain development. And that, when we appreciate that, it really starts to help us appreciate, in turn, the deep intertwinement of our social and emotional and cultural ways of reacting and being with each other and with ourselves and constructing a narrative out of that. Like, who am I in this space? How does the world work? And how do I feel in this world? And what does that mean for how I adapt myself advantageously to be able to manage myself safely in this context, right? And on the other hand, our ability to think. These things are not separate. They're actually overlapping. So when people feel that they're being watched, that they're being policed, that they're being constrained, that who they are, either they, in the direct sense right here, right now, or the group that they identify with, or that others identify them with, when they are feeling like they're under threat, and that the interpretations of those around them about what they're capable of and what their intentions are and who they are and why they're that, when those are being defined by the system in ways that are kind of pushing young people down, what happens is it shapes their brain development and their cognition, because those two things are really two ways to measure the same thing, right? It's shaping them around this kind of reactive, watch out for yourself, pay attention, react, you watch your back either culturally and emotionally and for your identity and or even physically, right? In some of the examples, the really heartbreaking examples that Jason mentioned. And the ironic part is that what we're learning neurologically is that in order to be able to construct a broader understanding, a broader narrative around what this all means and what I should do about it and who I am in this place in a way that's adaptive, that's reflective, that's constructive, where you actually have the space to make bigger meaning out of big issues like structural racism, like historic contexts, like physics environments and how gravity works, right? Like all of these kinds of complex issues are being built in a brain state that is fundamentally incompatible with looking over your shoulder and watching your back. When you are watching what's going on around you, you can't also kind of disengage from that immediate task orientation. Everybody, 1, 2, 3, all eyes on me, move your pencil on your paper, or, what are you doing over there in the corner, right? Anything that feels threatening, that pulls you into the here and now, is inherently pulling your neurology into a state where you're reacting rather than reflecting and building bigger meaning. So there's this insidious double-edged sword where you're both harming kids directly and also stealing away by virtue of asking them to adapt themselves to live safely in this dangerous environment, right? You're stealing away opportunities. You're failing to orchestrate safe opportunities for them to construct a bigger understanding of the world and who they are in it that would serve them well as they move forward into the future.
Okay, thank you. So huge ideas to start off with, to ground us as we think of this. And Mary Helen and Jason, both, thank you so much for kicking us off there. So, and I really appreciate the notion about you're constructing your subjective experience of context. And I know in our own work, measurement work and at the consortium, that we really came to see as we were measuring students' subjective experience of individual classrooms, that there was no, kind of the most surprising finding out of that for me is that there was no one overarching reality in a classroom. There were 25 or 30 subjective realities, and those subjective realities were what determined each individual student's participation, engagement, and grades in that context. So the notion that within a context there are multiple realities, and that those are in fact what shape learning and development. Really appreciate that. So if we take those big ideas and apply them really directly to the idea of policing in schools, and again, a broad definition of policing and surveillance and control, what do we know about how students experience that feeling, and what does it do in terms of threat to them? And what do we know about how this really varies for different students depending on race and identity questions? So how do different students experience policing in school, and what do we know about that?
Excellent question. There, I think, are a number of ways to respond. I also think that I look forward to hearing Mary Helen's response, because that was awesome the way you just explained that. And I'll be coming back to the subjective interpretation of things as well. Thank you for pointing that out. The experience for students, first of all, they know. They are aware and they feel it when they're being policed, even if they don't know that consciously. It's a feeling that can impact their behaviors. And that sense of policing can come from the physical context itself. For example, there's work on ambient belonging that just shows that based on what's in the room, the posters that are hanging from the walls, things of that nature can change people's actual performance in that space, academic performance in that space, or interest in a particular academic subject, for example. And so when I was talking about metal detectors, wired fences, and video cameras, that physically can do the work, but then also psychologically. And so just feeling like your group is not one that experiences respect in schooling in general, that can be based on your own lived experiences, experiences of your family members, your friends. Just watching television can communicate or let you know the negative stereotypes that exist about your group. Some work by Kristen Parker, Not Only Embodied, back in 2008 in Science, show that just by watching a brief clip of the most popular TV shows out in a time can increase somebody's implicit bias, meaning that these are sources of bias that are all around us, but also sources of stigma or threat, in that students can feel if a teacher not necessarily disciplining them, but also not necessarily showing that they value their perspective or that they respect and care about them, that indeed can feel like policing. And that what we see is that it's a trajectory that grows over time. As you know, this isn't a situation of like police officers and civilians like other work I do, when it's like a one-on encounter. Rather, these are relationships that exist across several months among students, but also between students and the adults in the school, such that something that's seemingly small or minor early on in the school year, semester, or term, it can then feed into how they then respond to that context. And so they might be a little bit less interested in that class. They could be a little slower to follow a teacher's instructions, which, as you know, can be interpreted as insubordination, willful defiance, reasons for them to then have an escalation in the discipline they receive. Now they have to go to the principal's office and potentially be suspended. And that just goes into or feeds into a recursive cycle. And I just mean the type of process that builds on itself, like a feedback loop, like a snowball effect, such that over time, seemingly minor slights or miscommunications or misinterpretations can grow to ultimately be the large and lasting inequities that we see in disciplinary outcomes, for example. I'd love to say more, but I like I said, I really want to hear what Mary has to say about this. So I'll stop there.
No, that's okay. That's amazing, Jason. So maybe like try to get the complementary way to think about it, right? That reinforces what Jason's saying, and because it says it from a different level of analysis. So if we tie this, the notion of experience, right, and subjective awareness and emotionally engaged interpretation that we're all doing all the time, right? If we tie that to learning and models of learning that we have in education, you might have seen there's a really great new paper by Naomi Nasir and Carol Lee and Roy P. and some others on the need for new models of learning that actually address the realities of what learning entails in a real context. If we think about what Jason is saying in terms of what it means for learning, we get a new appreciation for why academic performance is so tightly tied to the experiences kids have, either real or conjured in their mind, right, or they're watching themselves. So in models of learning and education, we focus very heavily on what's called semantic memory, right? Memory for facts and information, and procedural memory for how to do stuff, how to tie your shoes, how to solve long division problems, right? And basically all of our theories of memory and learning, quote unquote, that we are using to measure outcomes, to design curricula, are focused very centrally around those dimensions of memory, semantic and procedural. But there is a whole other kind of memory in the brain and in the mind that has been vastly studied for decades, which education, basically theories show no awareness of, and that is episodic memory. Memory for experience, memory for the story you are building of the ongoing interactions and lived opportunities and things that have happened as you subjectively live them, right? Not that Columbus is the capital of Ohio, but the time you visited Columbus with your grandma and what it was like and what, right? That kind of experiential memory, episodic memory, first of all, is the glue. It's the narrative that is the basis, cognitively speaking, and emotionally speaking, both, right, for deep learning, for memory that allows you to transfer outside of that setting and to use your factual and procedural knowledge for something. If you just know something, you know what a right triangle is, and you know how to solve a squared plus b squared equals c squared, that does you nothing in the world unless that knowledge is embedded into a rich contextualized personal memory of using it for things, which inherently means that rich contextual memory of using things is hugely shaped and sculpted by the experience, including the emotional experience and subjective cultural interpretations you had in that setting. So what that means is that the very nature of even our factual knowledge that we think of as not being cultural, right? Like, right triangles or something like that, or even we can debate that, but right, like this kind of factual information and procedural skills that we're asking kids to kind of deploy for us to prove they've learned is a teeny piece of what real learning does. Why does this really matter? Because I think this is the link. This is the long untalked about missing link that we're dancing around needing a cognitive science of, which is linking what you know to how you develop as a person. It's the episodic memory structures, and we actually show that in longitudinal work with young people from inner city Los Angeles. It's the way they activate, both in their psychosocial interviews with us and in the brain, systems for episodic memory construction, basically, that is allowing us to predict how their brain is going to develop and how psychosocially they're going to develop in terms of how happy they become, how rich and complex their identity development as young adults, how much they like themselves, how much they like their opportunities in school or work, whatever it is that they're doing, how much they have a coherent sort of sense of purpose by their own description. It's the episodic memories and the neural systems that support episodic memory foundation by pulling in the semantic and procedural memories in the service of a bigger narrative that is the essence of learning. And yet our schools and our accountability measures and our curricula don't incorporate that whole dimension of learning into the way we theorize about what a classroom is actually about and what it's actually for. And so when you take this back to policing, policing is basically setting up a set of circumstances that Jason just so beautifully described, shift how it feels to be in that space. What you've basically just done is hijack the episodic memory making process so that the most relevant information that goes into enriching that narrative is not about right triangles or about historical context and ways to make sense out of things that are going on, or about the kinds of skills you can be learning in an academic setting or in scholarly dispositional, like disciplinary learning. That is not what is enriching that narrative to make that narrative have the best explanatory and predictive power for you as an individual in that context.
Really, yes, really appreciate that. And if we go with that idea of both learning, academic, cognitive, scholarly, and development and identity development, developing our understanding of the world, how we fit in, what the world is like. Let's talk a little bit about just how impactful immediate contexts can be, for good or ill, in either reinforcing. So we know there's a broader set of racial stereotypes, stigma in society at large. So what is the role of an immediate context of a learning setting in either mediating and countering those narratives or reinforcing those narratives in a way that has impacts for people's long-term development, identity development, sense of understanding of what's what the world is like, who am I in this space? Like, how powerful because there's so much happening externally, and like, let's just ground it in the current day. We have a big backlash around anti-racism, around trying to teach true histories, trying to teach more culturally responsive curricula, and a huge backlash that students see and are aware of. And in many states, their teachers have been, legally now prohibited from teaching about their own cultures and race. So like, okay, so all that's going on in the big real world. how much power does a classroom or school have in shifting that episodic memory that Mary Ellen was just talking about? I'll open that to either one of you.
I can start. Short answer, a lot. Regardless of the bigger picture, we can be architects of context, and specifically school leaders and teachers are in pivotal positions to do so. For example, at the elementary school level, those students' relationship with their teachers, oftentimes the first meaningful and long-term relationship they've had with an adult outside of their family. And that builds the skills to navigate those type of relationships that then goes into middle and high school, where you then have multiple teachers and adults that you need to be able to, like, you need to learn how to interact with them. I got suspended in Memphis, Tennessee for insubordination, which, if you don't know what that means, exactly, subjective interpretation, which I'll come back to, the subjective interpretation of the adults in the school. For the exact same thing at the prep school I went to, like questioning an adult on some topic or something, that was rewarded. That was like, yeah, no, that's what we're here for. You need to learn how to make your case, how to build your argument, and be able to present that in a understandable way with adults. And so again, as another example of that, like the context can change, but something that you might ask is, like Jason, that story you just said, those were public schools in the state with some of the worst academic outcomes, period. And then you went to some elite prep school on an island. Like, how are we going to replicate that? No. I get that question, but let me tell you about science that we have right now, with work I've done with David Paunescu and Gregory Walton, that shows that just actually a very targeted shift in one teacher's mindset can change impacts, can change outcomes for many students at a time, and that it really has to do with coming back to that idea of being architects of context, and thinking in that way. And so that program, or that approach that we called empathic discipline, it speaks to valuing students' perspectives, remembering and understanding why we became educators in the first place, to help children learn and grow and become their best possible selves, and to especially do that when conflict arises or when students struggle or something of that nature. And so back to the first foundational point I was making about thinking about the biased context, or context that can allow bias to be functional, thinking about that as the problem space, as opposed to the idea that we need to deal with racist people. This is how something like that can be done, because that program did not mention racial bias at all. The approach was not interested in reducing people's bias. Rather, the target was to elevate people's context-based goals, elevate that reason why educators joined a profession in the first place, connect that to those actual situations in which it can be viewed as challenging by default. However, it can be viewed as an opportunity to indeed do those things you joined to do, that this is the prime time, this is how it looks. We did it in a scalable way. It was like a 45-minute exercise online. And so it could seem brief, but the delivery was important, and also a lot of the techniques that went into those materials to deliver that message that I just explained, to shift that mindset for teachers. And just to let you know, in an initial test against the control group, this cut suspension rates by 50% across 3 school districts, a predominantly Hispanic school district. And so it did seem to be the case that just by shifting a few mindsets of a few teachers, that can have large and lasting impacts for hundreds or thousands of students. That was a sample of 1,200 students. And something I didn't mention is that it was middle schools, and we only applied the program with math teachers, because every student had to have a math teacher. Every student only had one math teacher, so for logistical reasons. However, after the fact, if we take a step back, we have to remember that suspensions come from misbehavior in math class, science class, reading class, playground, cafeteria, bus ride to or from school. And so if there's a 50% reduction in suspensions, that meant by virtue of just having one teacher with this empathic mindset, or just showing a little bit more respect or empathy to this student, that student was less likely to get into trouble throughout their entire school experience, in their entire day. And indeed, we back that up with statistical research on which teachers were actually referring students to the office, and only 17% of that was math teachers. So for the most part, it seems like the biggest part of the effect was what was happening not with the treated teacher. And then recently, in a much larger sample in Florida, we ran the same study, this time a sample of 6,000 students that would be impacted. And key thing, we only intervened with math teachers, 66 of them. That this approach not only, again, led to a large, significant reduction in overall year-long suspension rates, but here is a more diverse student body in which we could determine racial disparities, and it significantly reduced racial disparities in suspensions. It significantly reduced disparities due to disability status in suspensions, and it significantly reduced disparities in which students who have been suspended before are more likely to be suspended again. This was actually especially beneficial for those students when their teachers had more of this empathic mindset. But then back to this point about architects of context, and how actually if we are very targeted within the context of the school or in the classroom, that we can indeed bring about the changes of interest. This second time, we actually were able to follow up with the data the year after the program. And so now when students have new teachers in the following year, they no longer have that teacher that received this program. What we found is that indeed, they still were significantly less likely to be suspended than their peers. And still, there was that significant mitigation or reduction of disparities in suspensions. And so that again implies that this is something that students take with them, that they feel it. They feel the difference with just that one teacher, and that they take it with them the rest of the school day. But it also looks like also in future years with different context entirely. But yeah, I'll stop there.
That's great. So connecting the dots between Mary Helen's notion of episodic memory and Jason's helps to explain some of the recursive effects of you do an intervention with one teacher in one space, and it has these big rippling effects in a young person's life. Mary Helen, want to add to that?
I don't want to add to that. That was perfect. That was great. Yeah, that's right. And thank you, Camille, for mentioning, right. That's the episodic memory piece. It goes with you, right? And it's not just, okay, so I will add to it, I lied. It's not just the content of the memory. It's the experience, the skill, the capacity for cultivating the kind of transcendent memory that gets you through, right? That moves you forward into the future, into possibility spaces that don't exist yet. And just to bring it back to the point I made really early, two things. First, the disposition of mind to do that in our experiments with Lois Yes youth from urban Los Angeles, the disposition of mind to engage in that kind of deeper transcendent meaning about interactions and about cultural things you've witnessed and stories in social world, the disposition to do that above and beyond IQ, above and beyond SES, parents' education level, ethnic group identification, and gender, is actually what is predicting the kids' brain growth over time. Like the thickness of their cortex in regions that involve stress and cognition and planfulness, prefrontal cortex, all that, and what we call the white matter structural integrity, right? The quality of wiring, literally how efficient those wirings are all around the head are built. They are built by kids' dispositions to engage in this kind of episodic memory building that's transcendent. And again, just to bring it back again, you need to feel safe emotionally, socially, culturally, and physically to be able to dispositionally engage in that kind of meaning making. You can't do it when you're under fire, when somebody's challenging you, threatening you, or when you feel like your identity is under fire or being threatened or challenged. Neurologically, you have to defend yourself or watch or be vigilant at that time. That's not a space for constructing that kind of disposition. But that kind of disposition is incredibly powerful as a force by which kids build their own brains. And I just want to be really clear that when I talk about brain development, I'm not talking about comparing kids to each other, right? What kind of brain does this kid have versus this kid? I'm talking about comparing kids to themselves 2 years before, right? So we have the kids come in at 14, 15 to 16 years old, and again 2 years later. We predict the brain development that kid will show compared to their own self 2 years before based on these dispositions of mind. And what Jason's showing is that simple, and also complex, right? Like even a simple kind of an intervention where you help teachers establish an empathic connection, a relationship space in which kids are safe to transcend and think more about who they are in that space and how they relate to other people beyond just reacting in a threat-based way. When you orchestrate context to do that in the way that Jason's work so beautifully demonstrates, it has real implications for these dispositions of mind, which in turn produce the kinds of brain development and coordinated psychosocial development that is associated with mental health and with academic success in a coordinated, overlapping way.
Thank you so much. Let's take a developmental lens for a second, and how does all of what we've talked about differ according to the age of a young person? So how do they experience threat or stigma or policing in elementary school versus middle school versus high school? Like how does it look different, or how does developmental stage come into play here as we think about their meaning making and what's going on for young people developmentally? Either of you can jump in.
I'll leave most of this to Mary Helen because I trust she knows way more about this than I do. And just say that the work that I was just talking about, the empathic discipline intervention, with David Ponescu and Gregory Walton, we tested that in middle schools and have started to look at some findings in high school, and it appears to be like effective for those groups. But then also separately, we have another arm of that work that's more practical, that's just school facing. And so like working with Illinois Department of Education, California Department of Education, of just like, how do we get this to schools, or how can they use it? We have found that this also is effective for elementary school students, and potentially even more effective for elementary school students. And so from those bodies of research together, I would speculate that the earlier you create these episodic memories, the better it can be, because you can then build a recursive cycle that can play out thereafter. But also you can avoid them being too much caught in the default context or mindset that is threatening.
It's fantastic to hear that you're doing this work with younger children too. So one thing is, just to be clear, people are making episodic memories one way or the other, right? From like age 2, 3, 4 years old, right? Depending on the cultural context, people are making these kind of memories. So we can either make them one way or frame them a different way. So absolutely, from the very beginning, it's really important. From a developmental perspective, I think the way to think about how educational practices and orchestrating context interacts with these developmental processes is really to think about that these developmental processes are engaged in characteristic ways that are that kids are growing into and through across from infancy all the way into old age. And so the place to look for the impacts are in the developmental sort of affordances and skills that a child is really about working on at that stage of their growth. And of course, those things are dynamic and context dependent. They're not constant. They're not linear. They're dynamic and nonlinear, right? But if we just think about it in a very, very gross way, stage-related development, in preschool, it's about managing your behavior and noticing other people's behavior and being able to act appropriately and constrain yourself when it's not your turn and like all that kind of stuff, right? So we see the threat playing out in how you do those things, right? As you get into elementary school, the work is really about taking those behavioral patterns and making representations out of them, writing about them, drawing them, talking about them, taking perspectives on them and relating those different perspectives together to make storylines and to understand deeper, interactions that are more complex. And so you see these threatening contexts play out in the way kids do that. When you transition into adolescence, to me, the hallmark of adolescence is really about this deep socially and emotionally situated drive to build transcendent stories about what it all is about. Who am I? What's my identity? Where do I come from? What kind of group am I part of? Who am I that moves across context, not just who am I here and now? I'm not just a dancer now. I'm a dancer, which is a whole disposition of identity that I bring with me everywhere, right? And that drive to do that is the place where you now see stereotype threat and these kinds of episodic memories of threat and of policing and of danger shaping, right? You're shaping the way kids are building these dispositional episodic stories about what it all means, and the lessons and ethical principles about how the world works, about who I am in it, like identity related things. That's where you're seeing the effects. So it's really, these effects are pervasive throughout development. They're fundamental to who we are as humans and to the ways that we think and grow, and even biologically and physically think and grow. And so the ways that our environments are going to shape those developmental processes is commensurate with the kinds of developmental processes that are really actively flexible and potentiated during that stage. And I'll say one other thing about development, and that is that we also are learning that there are very sensitive periods of development in the brain where these kinds of experiences can be especially poignant, both for good and for bad. And those periods tend to be periods where you have a lot of biological growth and change and hormonal growth and change, right? So it's always the whole human across their lifespan, but periods of particular sensitivity to social context are young childhood, right? Where you're growing a lot, right? And again, adolescence turns out to be a major period of brain development and instability in the brain that also is the flip side of potential for growth, right? There's now good evidence that adolescents with adequate opportunity can actually rework brain systems that were shaped deeply by trauma early on across that adolescent plasticity period. But it's also a period, the flip side of plasticity and potential is always vulnerability. It's also a period where kids really need that social support. If they don't have it, then that's another period, then it's a liability. It's something that's especially dangerous for them. And then a third period, which also matters for people, especially who are doing young child services and education and in community engagement, a third period of remarkable brain plasticity, actually, is the next period of life where you characteristically have major hormonal fluctuations, and that is in the transition to parenting. So when adults have their first child, and subsequent children, right? The hormonal fluctuations of co-regulating around each other and the child in a new way are also associated with windows of neurological plasticity, particularly in the frontal cortex, which is a part of the brain that's very involved in a planful behavior, executive capacity and control. I mean, imagine that. Why would you need that when you've got a new newborn, right? I mean, these things are developed just in time. They're developed because you need them. But what it means is that the developmental plasticity is there, then you have to support and leverage it. So another period of really potential for programming and supports to really help is again around that transition to parenting, which has the dual effect of helping the young parents and also of helping their infants.
May I quickly add some information also? I think somewhat answered some of the questions that I was saying, but definitely in line with Mary Helen is talking about. First of all, as a recent new parent, I wish I heard you say that a long time ago. I was very confused when we got pregnant and how I was feeling. I'm like, never had anxiety before. What is this? But thank you. The idea about specific points that can be happening early in development, just to make a vivid example, we found that this approach, like the empathic discipline approach and looking at teachers' perspectives of students, reduced recidivism to jail So that literal part of policing, some work that I did with Gregory Walton and Jennifer Eberhardt that was published about 2 weeks ago. The point being that if you just heard one of these stories about what these kids experienced when they were either removed from school, arrested, or were in jail, it becomes very clear that that experience at the age of 12, that's going to stick with them and be affecting them definitely moving forward, and it's heartbreaking. So I'm not necessarily going to share one of those examples now, but just like really think about what that actual experience would be. Because I regularly remember what it was like when I got suspended, and I was like an A student, and I had all this pride about myself, and it's just like, wait, you don't want me here? And so there's that. Also on the topic of development, we've kind of spoken what the experience is like. David Yeager has some work looking at institutional trust at around middle school, similar to what Mary Helen is saying about the pivotal period in which people are having hormonal differences, identity development, puberty, things of that nature, that Black students seeing how other Black students were treated disciplinarily in school decreased their sense of trust in the school and predicted themselves getting suspended or disciplined the years thereafter, all the way up to them having less likelihood of college matriculation. And so there's the experience of just seeing what's going on around you that can have those lasting impacts, and that there's something critical happening at that middle school level. In David Yeager's work, it was specifically 6th grade and 7th grade. And then I'll skip that for the sake of time. But then the research by Jeffrey Cohen, Gregory Walton, and some others on belonging uncertainty, if we look at the control condition compared to the interventions they designed on belonging, it appears to be the case that the default is a sense of not belonging for students from racially stigmatized groups, and that they're very likely, or that there's a lot of ambiguity and room for improvement at transitional periods. And so like also at this level, when they're transitioning to middle school, which is work we did with Parker Goyer, published 2019, but also his seminal work in Belonging Certainty from 2009, is at the transition to college level. And so it's important to think about the changes that are happening in context, as well as the changes that are happening developmentally, and be strategic in one's approach. But there's also just want to leave you with, there is hope, and I'm going to try to do this as much as I can towards the end of this to not leave you all in a bad state, that even if they've had early traumas, that across those topics or programs or approaches that I've mentioned, they've still been able to offset them if that program happens years later. When they're in middle school and they had an episode or something of that nature in elementary school, that by virtue of just having one teacher treat them differently can really make a huge difference. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on those things quickly.
Thank you, Jason. And yeah, if there was one big idea that I would really push in all of this, is that it is less, what impacts learning and development is less about what you experience and much more about how you make meaning of that experience, and that adults play such a critical role in mediating how young people make sense of experiences that happen to them. In just like 2 minutes that we have, I want to switch. There were several questions that have to do with adults, and like, what do adults, particularly teachers, educators, people in learning settings, what do they need to know? And how important is the relationship of adults to one another in shaping what's going on with how young people are experiencing a setting? So just like broadly, what is the role of adults in this? And if we think about teacher education, we think about that kind of thing, like, well, what do adults need to know to really, as one person said, to communicate these core disruptive ideas that challenge what's perceived as the main task of teachers, which is to just deliver content.
That was a lot. So I'll try. And I'll also just throw in there quickly the empathic discipline, if it's research, empathic instruction, if it's just practice, the framing, teachers love it. Teachers unions are usually ones that call us in because it does not point a finger at teachers, rather it elevates their voices, and it's framed as an opportunity for them to report how they actually feel, their experiences and their expectations in their classrooms. Apparently people don't ask them those questions. So it's framed that way, and that makes it very meaningful for them, and that's how they go into it. It's like the equivalent of a professional development, but they're not being spoken to, but rather they're sharing what their experiences are. The teacher-student relationship is incredibly critical for the things that we're talking about. To answer that part of the question, Pianta had research back, I don't remember the year, but it showed that conflict with a teacher for a student when they're in elementary school, like 4th grade, predicts their disciplinary action all the way through high school, all the way through the end of their secondary education. It makes a huge difference. It's just pivotal, and the school principals as well. We found that the same processes apply to principals and assistant principals, and that a similar approach could be effective as well. Of course, they have a different relationship with students. They're not actually seeing their behaviors for the most part. For the most part, if there's policing involved, they're just getting the description of what happened from the teacher involved. And there's different types of things that should go into that, like reconciliation. Part of restorative practices, for example, is something I would recommend. The interactions or relationships amongst teachers are also important. Some very recent work that we just submitted to the National Academy of Sciences with Jennifer Eberhardt and Sean Darling Hammond is, yeah, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but essentially viewing one Black student misbehave increases the likelihood of wanting severe discipline for other Black students as one aspect of it. And another aspect of it, and another body of research, is that teachers talk. And we looked at, what does it matter if a teacher in the break period tells another teacher about a student in terms of them having a good reputation or a poor one? It matters, and it matters for all students. But interestingly, for Black students, it doesn't matter as much, because automatically across the board, they're being viewed as, or it's being assumed that they have a bad reputation. But for the white students, when a teacher hears from another teacher that a white student has a bad reputation, they just end up looking more like a Black student. Sorry to put it that way, but that's what the findings show. That was quick. I hope that answered some of those questions for me. I'll stop.
Thank you. And unfortunately, Mary Helen, I wish I could jump over to you, but I'm gonna turn it over to Sam because we're up at the top of the hour. But Jason and Mary Helen, thank you both so much for engaging in this conversation.
What an incredible discussion. I'm echoing my thanks as well on behalf of the Soda Alliance. Thank you, Mary Helen. Thank you, Jason, for such a rich, insightful discussion. We are at time, but I invite you to join us. We'll be having part 2 of this discussion, where we'll be bringing together practitioners and district leaders to really continue to explore this topic of policing. And the title of that will be, Who is Policed in Our Schools and Why? So we invite you to join us November 10th at 3 p.m. right here on this very Zoom. So more information will go out about that. And we also invite you to continue to follow our work. If you want to learn more about the Soda Alliance, more about our practice principles, learn more about just staying in touch with Soda News, feel free to follow us on Twitter at Soda Alliance or visit our website at sodalliance.org. Again, thank you, Mary Helen. Thank you, Camille. Thank you, Jason. And hope you all have a lovely day. Thank you.